Well, good morning. Thank you so much, Pierce, for that gracious welcome. I appreciate those gracious words. I am, as he said, their pastor of community discipleship, and it is a privilege for me to serve the church. And I am honored to be here with you today to bring the word of God. So thank you to the Harvest team and family for inviting me here. So we are wrapping up a series from 2 Corinthians where we've been talking about what it means to walk by faith. And today we're going to talk about something that fascinates, confuses, sometimes terrifies most people. We are talking about life after death. Because in our passage today, Paul is going to talk about, as believers, the hope that we have for the future, our belief in heaven and our heavenly home. Now, the belief that we will live somewhere forever, well, it has shaped civilization throughout history. And you can find many differing viewpoints. The Australian Aborigines pictured heaven as an island off on the horizon. And the Native Americans, they pictured the afterlife, that their spirits would hunt the spirits of buffalo. And the Peruvians and the Polynesians, well, they believed when they died, they would go to the sun or to the moon. And in the Gilgamesh epic, which is a Babylonian legend, it depicts a resting place for heroes, and it hints at a tree of life. And the Egyptians, when they buried their embalmed bodies in a pyramid, they would include a map to serve as a guide to the afterlife. And the Romans, well, they believed that the righteous would picnic in the fields, the Elysian fields, while their horses grazed nearby. And now all of these viewpoints are differing, but the unifying testimony of the human spirit throughout the ages has been in the belief of life after death. And anthropological evidence points to that every culture has had an innate sense of the eternal and the belief that there was something more than this world. And I would imagine that everyone in here has at least at some point thought about what happens when you die. It's inescapable. There's mystery that surrounds it. It's unavoidable. And there is an age in which you first realize that we don't live forever and that death is a reality. Now, for my boys, my twins, it came at a very young and traumatic age when my husband and I decided that it would be a great idea to buy them fish. And we had to buy a lot of fish because apparently the Riley family cannot keep fish alive. And so I tell you that explaining to toddlers and consoling them over and over again about why their fish were floating on the top of the water, holding fish funerals, listening to cry as we gave them a burial at sea is not for the faint of heart. And did I promise that we would one day see these goldfish and betta fish in heaven again? Maybe. But will they actually be there? I will let you decide that. So in our passage today in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul explains how our promise of a future resurrection, it should affect our life right here and right now. So here's what I want to do today. I want to talk about 3 truths that Paul teaches us about walking by faith in light of eternity. And the first truth I want to talk about is this. Walking by faith means that we long for more than this world. Paul writes, starting in verse 1, he says, "For we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, and we have a building from God, an eternal house in the heaven, not built by human hands. Meanwhile, we groan, longing to be clothed instead with our heavenly dwelling, because when we are clothed, we will not be found naked. For while we are in this tent, we groan and are burdened, because we do not wish to be unclothed, but to be clothed instead with our heavenly dwelling, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. So 3 times in this passage, Paul presents our bodies as a tent, and he calls our future homes a heavenly dwelling. So in the book of Acts, we find out that Paul is a tent maker by trade. So it's not really a surprise that he would compare our bodies to a tent. Now, I can't get into all the details here. So I'm just going to let you know that I had some wild years in college. And part of those wild years included following around a band from place to place for their concerts. And there was one particular summer where we followed this band around, and quite often we couldn't afford a hotel, so we would stay in tents in the campground from city to city. And this is where I learned that I am not a tent girl. I am not. They are complicated to put up. They don't always stay up. They are not comfortable. There are issues with temperature. There are threats of wildlife. And now I know that many of you, happy campers, love to go camping, love to be in your tent, and I am so happy for you. But I am not at home in a tent. And if you think about what you know about a tent is not really a place that you want to be in to weather a storm. If you have owned a tent for any amount of time, then you know that they fall apart. They aren't meant to last forever. And if you are over the age of 40 like me, then you understand how your tent is wearing down, it's breaking down. It's incredible how you can go to bed at night thinking, I feel pretty good. And you can wake up in the morning and realize that you have injured yourself in your sleep. That there is a new ache, a new pain, something that wasn't there yesterday. Our this tent is just not weathering the storms the way that it used to. Our tents aren't made to live forever. And someone once asked John Quincy Adams at the age of 81 how he was. And he answered, John Quincy Adams is quite well, thank you. But the house in which he lives is becoming dilapidated. I think John Quincy Adams will have to move out pretty soon, but he himself is quite well indeed. Now, all of this could be kind of depressing, but Paul says, don't lose hope. When our earthly tent, our home, is destroyed, we can look forward to a new one. And we get an upgrade. So I'm picturing this building made by God for me. I'm gonna get a luxury version one day. Maybe I'll go for like a French chateau. Maybe a beachfront mansion or a gorgeous cabin in the woods. Because if we're gonna dream about heaven, y'all, we might as well just dream big. The Message explains this by saying, compared to what is coming, living conditions around here seem like a stopover in an unfurnished shack. And we are tired of it. We've been given a glimpse of the real thing, our true home, our resurrection bodies. The Spirit of God whets our appetites by giving us a taste of what's ahead. But this life in the tent, it is not easy. There is pain, there is suffering, there are afflictions as our tent begins to break down, which is why Paul writes in verse 2, meanwhile we groan, longing to be clothed instead with our heavenly dwelling. And I have to admit that this idea of longing for heaven or wanting something more was not really a reality for me until my late 20s. In fact, I was pretty happy with my earthly tent. I kind of liked this earthly dwelling place where I lived. So I had a rocky childhood. I had a wild young adult years, but once I gave my life to Jesus in my 20s, my life really got back on track. I walked away from a life of bad behavior and poor choices and destructive friends, and I began to live my life in a way in which I was seeking to be obedient to God. I married a great guy. We began building a life together. We moved from place to place as God opened up doors for our careers. In fact, it was going so well that at one point, I remember I was in an interview to advance in my position with the corporation I was working for at the time. And I was asked in the interview by a man, tell me about a time that you wanted something that you could not have. And arrogant, young, 25-year-old me said, well, I can't think of a time that I haven't gotten what I wanted. And I remember the look on his face. He said, oh, just you wait. Just you wait. You will be disappointed in life because at some point in life, you are going to want something that you cannot have. And he was right, because about 2 years from that interview, I sat across the desk from an infertility specialist who told me that most likely children would not happen for me biologically. And that started a multi-year process of pills and procedures and injections. And I don't know if you are familiar or how you know this process, but it can really make you crazy. It is a roller coaster of emotions as each month, all of those energy and money and time in your body that you've put into this, and the answer is no. And then you kind of have to just pull yourself up from that no, and you have to get all excited again and energetic to start the process again, only to have the answer be no over and over again. And in the middle of all of that, God moved us to Houston. My husband's job transferred him here to a city of almost 7 million people where we knew not one single soul. And so I told God in the way that I often tell God, like, this is not working for me. I don't know why you would move me 10 hours away from all my family, all my friends, when you know that I'm trying to have a baby here. And so when we moved here, my transition here was really hard. I felt isolated. I felt lonely. I felt like God had forgotten me. I had no idea what God was doing. I felt lost spiritually. And I also felt lost physically because for the life of me, I could not figure out how to drive a feeder road. Y'all, we don't have feeder roads in Alabama. You just get off the exit and that's all there is. You don't have to circle around. I just circled and circled trying to figure out where it was I was supposed to be going. But after a while, we found a new church. That was an important part of this. And we joined a Sunday school class. We made friends. I felt like I was improving physically and spiritually, and so we decided to give it a go one more time with a new doctor here in Houston. And so we have our consultation with him, and he reviews our medical records and everything we've done, and he said, I'm gonna get you pregnant on the first month. I said, okay. And guess what? He did. And we shared our happiness at Papacitos like good Texans who eat queso and chips to celebrate. We got it. And not only was I was pregnant with triplets. The joke in my day then was maybe we prayed just a little too hard for this. But we were very excited. But a pregnancy of multiples carries a lot of risk. And I was a high-risk pregnancy because of my issues. And so it progressed with sort of this mixture of both joy at finally being pregnant, but fear, absolute terror that something was going to happen and that I was going to lose these babies. I was so sick. I struggled to carry them, and they were pumping calories and things into me to try to help me carry these babies to term. And so we were seeing multiple high-risk doctors, and so about a little over halfway there, we're in our 20 weeks, we went to our high-risk specialist, as we often did, and to have an ultrasound to check on things, and we were pregnant with 2 boys and a girl, Beckett, Eli, and Ruby. And so we go into the appointment, and they check everything, and Beckett looks great. and they checked Eli, and everything looked great. And then they got to Ruby. And I knew from the look on the technician's face that something must be very wrong. And he quickly excused himself to go get the doctor. And so I lay there holding my husband's hand, sobbing, knowing already that something wasn't good. And so the doctor comes in and she says, "I'm so sorry, but Ruby no longer has a heartbeat. She's gone." And I know that any of you know that the moment that a child is conceived, you have all these dreams for them. Dreams for my daughter, dreams of what her relationship would be like with her brother, dreams of how she would play with all these dolls I have in my attic from my mother. There's dreams that you would have, and they all died that day. And not only that, her passing, her demise, it put me at even more risk. Because what generally happens is that signals to your body that it's time to deliver, and there were risk of blood clots and all sorts of things. So the doctors were very honest with us that there's a real possibility you could just lose all three. And so it was a day by day crying out, wrestling, begging, taking care of myself, pleading that God would let me deliver the boys. And he did. I delivered 2 beautiful, wonderful baby boys. And it was the best and worst day of my life because we also delivered Ruby. And the reality of it truly hit me as we were driving home from the hospital. I realized that I had known that Ruby was gone, but now she was physically gone, that I would never be with her again, at least on this side of eternity. And so I was wrestling with my faith and my emotions because on one hand, I was ecstatic to be a new mom and to have these 2 beautiful baby boys that we had prayed about for so long. But on the other hand, I just wanted to be with my girl. I just wanted her, and I longed for her, and I longed for heaven. And the reality of my body and its brokenness and this world and its brokenness, it really set in for me for the very first time that I longed for something more than this world. God had put eternity in my heart. And I know that many of you have lost a loved one. You have gone through terrible loss and grief and pain. And so you understand what it means to long for heaven, to walk out your faith day by day, moving forward, knowing that there is more to life than this. And Paul wrote about this because Paul understood this deep grief and this weight of this pain that comes from living in this temporary world. So he wrote, "So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light and momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal." So walking by faith means that we long for more than this world, that we know where our true home is, and that as we live out our faith day by day, we have the hope that comes from knowing that these afflictions, that these sufferings, that these losses, they're temporary. These are not our true home. And we look forward to the day of resurrection, and we live with heaven in our hearts. So the second truth Paul teaches is this: walking by faith means we have the confidence to live with courage. So Paul goes on to write, "Therefore, being always of good courage, knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord. For we walk by faith, not by sight, but we are of good courage, and prefer rather to be absent from the body and to be home with the Lord." So Paul uses this language of we know that our earthly tent will be destroyed. We know that while we're living in the body, we know these things. and because we know, we can be of good courage. As Paul says that a clear view of the coming glory should mean that our present life is marked with confidence. And being of good courage, it means to have an attitude of confidence or a firmness of purpose in the face of danger or testing. It means to have certainty. And Paul is writing this because at times he experienced the exact opposite of good courage. Paul faced great discouragement. He faced opposition, he faced persecution, he faced attack on his characters, he faced all types of obstacles in his life, and there were times in which Paul felt discouraged. And his time in Corinth is one of them. So Paul comes to Corinth from Athens, where he was not received well either. And when he comes to Corinth, it tells us in the earlier chapters of 2 Corinthians that he came with fear and trembling because Paul was overwhelmed by the size of the immorality in the city. And the Bible dictionary defines discouragement as a sense of unhappiness arising from the loss of confidence in one's own abilities, in the reliability of God, or in the power of the gospel. And walking by faith, living out this Christian life, it is challenging. It is not easy. And there are times in which we will feel discouraged in our faith. And when I think about the seasons of my faith where I have felt discouraged, one of those is because there are prayers that I have prayed for years that God has not answered. For the better part of 20 years, I have prayed prayers for my health, I have prayed prayers for my family, and yet God has not answered. No matter how much I've cried out, no matter how much I've asked or pleaded or been back to the throne of God over and over again, He has yet to answer them. So every time I have an issue with my health, and every time something happens in my family, I just can become discouraged because God has not answered those prayers. Maybe for you, you've had seasons of failure. You've had relational brokenness. You have prayers yourself that haven't been answered. You have tried to faithfully walk out your faith, and yet still things continue to happen to you in your life. I think if you follow Jesus faithfully for any amount of time, then you will become discouraged at some point. And in those seasons of discouragement, there is one thing that I have found to be a lifeline for me: encouragement. See, in Corinth, God did something that brought Paul great encouragement. God brought new friends into his life and a team to support him. It tells us in the book of Acts that after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. And there he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker as they were, he stayed and worked with them. And every Sabbath, he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade the Jews and Greeks. And when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. So Paul arrives in Corinth, and he makes his way to the market where he finds a tent maker couple, Priscilla and Aquila. And they become good friends, and Paul moves in with them. He actually lives with them in Corinth. And when they leave Corinth, Priscilla and Aquila go with him to Ephesus. And then later, when they move to Rome, they go there also. And it is believed that they were with Paul when he died. And then God also sends Timothy and Silas. And they come from Macedonia through Berea and Thessalonica. So when Paul was kicked out of those cities, Silas and Timothy stayed behind to encourage those who had become followers of Jesus. And now they arrive in Corinth, bringing a gift from the church in Thessalonica sent with love and appreciation to support and encourage Paul. God provided new friends when he arrived in Corinth, and he brought his old friends to love and encourage him. And this is the way that we fight discouragement, with each other. Encouragement fights discouragement and allows us to live with confidence and good courage. And the book of Hebrews, it tells us that we should encourage one another daily. So I wanted you to think about this morning is your practice of encouragement. How often do you encourage the people in your life? I think the fact that Hebrews says that we need to do it daily speaks to the necessity of encouragement in our walk of faith. So is there someone today that you need to encourage when you leave here? Is there a text you need to send, a phone call you need to make, an email you need to write, or a note that you need to drop in the mail? Who in your life could use encouragement today? And I will tell you that I have found this church to be marked by encouragement. When I was struggling to finish seminary, feeling overwhelmed by my job responsibilities, school, being a mom, and being a wife, there were times that I truly felt like giving up. And in those times, someone would write me an email, a text, someone would drop off a note, and those words kept me going. They kept me from feeling discouraged. Henry Nouwen says that Christian community is the place where we can keep the flame of hope alive among us and take it seriously so that we can grow and become stronger. So we encourage each other to live by faith with confidence and courage. Living by faith means that we long for more than this world. We live courageously. And lastly, walking by faith means the goal of our life is pleasing Christ. Paul writes, so we make it our goal to please him, whether we are at home in the body or away from it. So there can be this idea, this line of thinking, that if this is temporary, if our bodies are temporary and this place is temporary and our salvation is secure in Jesus, does it really matter how we live? If all of this is going to fade away anyway, what is the point? And Paul addresses that line of thinking, and he clears it up because he says that as believers, we have a clear goal for our life, living our lives faithfully in a way that pleases Christ. And I think the language of pleasing Christ can be a little bit confusing because we know that God loves us. We know that God delights in us. We know that we don't have to earn God's favor. So what does it mean to live to please Christ? Pleasing Christ means that we live by the Spirit in full submission and surrender, desiring obedience as we walk out our faith and are transformed into the image of Christ. It is our pursuit of holiness. And holiness simply means that we live our lives in a way in which we are set apart for God's glory. That there should be something different about us, something different about the way we live. It is living in a way that honors God, and our holiness, it gives us something. It gives us a glimpse into glory to come. So as the band comes out, I want to share with you a quote. It comes from J.C. Ryle, who is an Anglican bishop. He wrote a collection of 20 papers in the 1800s, and his work is essential in helping us understand our holiness and heaven. And he wrote, without holiness on earth, we shall never be prepared to enjoy heaven, because heaven is a holy place. The Lord of heaven is a holy being. The angels are holy creatures. Holiness is written on everything in heaven. So when we live our lives in a way that are set apart, when we live our lives in a way that glorifies God, when we fight the sin in our life and we become transformed into the image of Christ, we are getting just a small glimpse of heaven, of the glory that is to come. The reality is, this is all temporary. Our bodies are temporary. Our homes are temporary. And that changes the way that we live. So we walk by faith. We long for heaven, for more than this world. We encourage each other to live our faiths with confidence and good courage. And we make it the goal of our life to please Christ. Let me pray for us. God, we thank you that you sent your glory from heaven in the form of your son, Jesus, who died the death on the cross so that this would not be permanent for us, so that this would be temporary and we would join you one day in our heavenly home. So this morning, God, I want to lift up anyone who's here today, who's worshiping online, who, God, they are weary in their bodies. God, they face a diagnosis, they face a chronic illness. God, they are suffering in the hardship of what it means to live in this temporary body. I want to lift up those who know the longing, who are feeling grief, who are feeling pain, who are feeling the loss of someone that they love dearly, and they are living with that day in and day out and that hurt. So right now, God, I just want to declare your presence over them. I want to ask you for complete healing for their health. God, won't you deliver them from their pain, from their illness, from their suffering, from the thing that keeps them from full wholeness and health in you. God, won't you do that right now? And God, I pray for those who the pain of the longing and the suffering, God, that it just feels like too much. Won't you comfort them? Won't you heal their hearts, God? Won't you make your presence so known to them that they feel wrapped in your love and peace? And then, God, I pray for those who feel discouraged in their faith. God, for those prayers that you haven't answered yet, God, won't you answer them? If it is your desire, and it is a good desire, God, answer those prayers. God, give us the patience to wait in those seasons of discouragement when our relationships feel broken, where our faith, it doesn't feel, God, like we are walking with you, God, and we, no matter how hard we try, we just can't seem, God, to get it right or to figure it out. And then, God, right now, I want you to place on our hearts and in our minds right now the name of the person who needs encouragement from us when we leave here today. Give us those names, put them on our heart, give us the boldness and the courage to shoot those texts, encourage people today. May we be a body of people who encourage each other on, who cheer each other on, who pick each other up when they're feeling down, as we all move forward in our faith with confidence and courage together. And God, we present ourselves today as a sacrifice to you. God, make us holy. God, help us to make the goal of our life simply and only pleasing you, so that one day we will all be together. We will all stand in the eternal glory, God, of your presence. And it is in your name, your holy and precious name, that we pray today. Amen.